afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to see you here today. My name is Neal Stulberg. I'm the Director of Orchestral Studies and Artistic Director of the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. So pleased that you could join us in the hall and also on live stream. And I welcome you to part 2 of our Milken Center series this year, exploring the remarkable music and legacy of a largely forgotten artistic union of early 20th century Russian composers called the St. Petersburg Society for Jewish Folk Music. I've been studying, researching, collecting, performing, recording this music since the mid-1990s. And as I mentioned in our November concert, the artistic aspirations and achievements of the Society not only pointed the way for much of Jewish art music to follow in the 20th century, including in North America, but is an inspirational story for any artist of today looking to join with others to create something new based on shared heritage and passions. As those of you who attended the last concert will remember, part 1 presented solo and chamber music, solo piano and chamber music by 3 society composers, Alexander Krein, Alexander Vaprik, and Mikhail Gnessin. Today's program focuses on art songs, that intimate and hyper-expressive genre in which a single singer, accompanied by piano, conveys words and stories in music. I'm joined on stage this afternoon by 2 wonderful singers, baritone Raphael Frider and soprano Roksana Zeinapur. You can read about them in your QR code program, where you'll also find an overview about the Society. First, very brief refresher. What was the St. Petersburg Society, and how did it come about? Russian Jews in the late 19th century faced enormous and often violent anti-Semitism, personally, systemically, and governmentally. They were mainly confined to what is now called the Pale of Settlement, where my family was from, far away from the major centers of Russian culture, and were the subject of severe entrance quotas at the major universities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. But there were exceptions, and one of these, amazingly, was the admissions policy of the Moscow and St. Petersburg conservatories, which actually welcomed Jewish students to a much greater extent than other universities did. For a complete discussion of this phenomenon, you can consult James Leffler's wonderful 2010 book about this movement called The Most Musical Nation, Jews and Culture in the Late Russian Empire. By the early 20th century, Jewish student composers at these universities were in the composition classes of the leading Russian composers, Rimsky-Korsakov, Lyadov, Glazunov, and others. This was also the era of increasing nationalism in musical composition. Bartok, Kodai, Janacek, Defaya, in our own country, Ives. So many, as well as the spread of Richard Wagner's poisonous anti-Semitic writings, the most notorious of which, the 1869 Das Judentum in der Musik, or Judaism in Music, was published in its Russian translation in St. Petersburg in 1908. Legend has it that one day in composition class, Rimsky asked his students, "Why should you Jewish students imitate European and Russian composers? The Jews possess tremendous folk treasures. Jewish music awaits its Glinka." The students listened. Concerts began to be organized. Ethnographic expeditions were arranged with the new invention called the phonograph. A publishing house, scholarly journal, concert ensemble, including musicians like Heifetz, Chalyapin, an archive, touring, a big movement. In 1908, the movement coalesced into a formal artistic union called the St. Petersburg Society for Jewish Folk Music. Its goal was nothing less than the creation of an entirely new category of classical music, concert music infused with Jewish content, be it liturgical, folk, or text-based. The Society's young composers began to freely adapt the collected materials, creating work in every conceivable genre, including solo, chamber, orchestral, opera, theater, art songs, choral, and in strikingly individual musical vocabularies. It begat what one would call in Russia in the late 1920s, what was called the Jewish National School of Russian composition. Among these musicians were many composers, some of whom had grown up in very traditional religious families, others having been exposed to more secular influences. But crucially, unlike the so-called Entartete Musik or recovered voices composers who were repressed by the Nazis, whose music began to be resurrected and brought to light many years ago now, these composers were trying to do something quite different. Today's program, like the November concert, is divided into 3 parts, separated by brief breaks. The first set juxtaposes music by 2 of the Society's foundational figures, Joel Engel and Lazar Saminsky. After a brief pause, we feature 4 works by Moshe Milner, whose art songs, to me, rival those of Mussorgsky in their directness and power. And after another brief pause, our program concludes with music from The Story of the Red-Haired Motala, a wildly creative song cycle from the late 1920s by Mikhail Gnessin, with texts drawn from a notorious 1922 poem by a then 22-year-old Russian Jewish poet named Joseph Achron. So, let's dig in about part 1 for a moment. I've labeled part 1 Engel versus Saminsky, because these 2 composers had firmly held and very different ideas of what constituted, quote-unquote, authentic sources of Jewish music. Over many years, they carried on a contentious public debate about this issue in the Society's scholarly journal. To simplify the argument a bit, Engel felt that both folk and liturgical sources were authentic expressions of Jewish music. Saminsky, a brainy polymath, trained also as a mathematician and philosopher, and a famously disputatious character, was deeply suspicious of folk sources that he contended were, quote-unquote, infected with the music of other European folk traditions, the Roma, the Hungarian, the Romanian, etc., producing in his mind a kind of warmed-over, unoriginal, and therefore unhealthy foundation on which to base music befitting an ancient noble tradition. He felt that the authentic sources for the Jewish future were to be found in far-flung communities seemingly untouched by their encounters with modernity. For example, in synagogue chants in remote regions of the Caucasus region, which he faithfully notated and incorporated into his music. So we start with 2 works of Engel. Born in 1868 to a secular family in Ukraine, Engel studied law at Kharkiv University and then entered the Moscow Conservatory at the urging of Tchaikovsky, who had heard some of his music. He had no background or interest in Jewish music until he encountered the famous critic Vladimir Stasov, who urged him to explore his Jewish roots. This became the focus of Engel's research and music in the 1900s. Eventually, he became a pivotal figure in establishing the Society in 1908. Although today he might be seen as more of an ethnomusicologist and critic than as a first-rate composer, his influence was enormous in 20th century Jewish art music and also in the modern klezmer revival movement. Engel was a member of the first of several ethnological expeditions in 1912 that was organized to traditional Jewish communities in the Pale of Settlement. Loeffler's The Most Musical Nation tells this really fascinating story about that first expedition. On the first day of July, 1912, the regular morning train from Kiev pulled slowly into a provincial railroad station about 3 miles outside the town of Ruzhin. On board was a typical cross-section of the rural population of the western Ukraine, peasants and Jewish merchants returning home from business in the big city, Russian soldiers en route to border postings, Hasidic Jews on pilgrimage to visit the former home of the legendary Hasidic Rebbe, the Tzaddik of Rushin. Among this mixed crowd of travelers, 3 passengers awkwardly stood out. Descending from the train, the trio huddled self-consciously together on the platform, speaking to one another in rudimentary Yiddish. Their journey was not a homecoming, nor was it quite a religious pilgrimage or even a business trip. And yet it was a bit of all 3. For together these men, Engel, Ansky, the great Jewish ethnologist and the author of the famous D-Book, and Solomon Yudovin, a young art student, represented the first members of the newly launched Jewish historical ethnographic expedition. Despite all the sober theoretical discussions back in St. Petersburg early that year, the ethnographic expedition turned out to be as much of a cultural adventure and nostalgic idyll as a scholarly research endeavor. From the moment of their arrival, Engel recounted later, the trio agreed to speak only in Yiddish, despite the fact that none of the men spoke it well. Their first attempts to negotiate with a local Jewish coachman led initially to comic misunderstanding. The wagon driver, named Henoch, was a traditional small-town Jew who had no idea what to make of the strangely dressed big city intellectuals speaking a broken Yiddish. Assuming they were mocking him, Henoch refused to answer in Yiddish, but instead responded to Ansky's repeated questions in Ukrainian. Eventually, he decided that the travelers were actors, only to change his mind and conclude that Ansky was a cantor and Engel his choir master. Engel recalled this idea delighted him, for it turned out that synagogue songs was his passion. Once the musical connection was established, Henoch immediately warmed up to his passengers, especially when Engel showed him the phonograph, that brand new device. Soon the coachman switched back into Yiddish. As they rode slowly towards the town of Ruzhin, he regaled his curious passengers with tales of the Ruzhin tzaddik, or holy man, offering to guide them through the town's musical universe. It was on this expedition that Engel first heard about the first work on today's program, the Kaddish of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev. If you follow the text of the work, do you have text? Oh, great. Okay. Can you read it? Is there enough light? Okay. If you follow the text of this work, you will see that it's a kind of legal brief or hearing that this rabbi, a legendary religious leader from the late 18th and early 19th centuries, known popularly as the, quote, defense attorney for the Jewish people, unquote, presents to God on behalf of his people. It's in the tradition, the Jewish tradition, of arguing with God, and is remarkable both for its reference to modern regimes. He references the Russian Tsar, the German Kaiser, the English king, although interestingly, the Russian reference never made it into Engel's version, and is a plea for an end to the suffering of the Jewish people. Notably, the great Black American singer and activist Paul Robeson sang Engel's arrangement of the Kaddish in its original Yiddish at a 1958 concert in Moscow, despite being warned by the concert's sponsoring committee not to do it. In introducing the song, Robeson said, quote, "And now I shall sing an anti-imperialist song for you, which you may not have heard in some time. It was written more than 150 years ago by a Russian as a protest against the Tsar. The name of the author is Levi Yitzchak, and he lived in the city of Berdichev." Engel moved from Moscow to Berlin in 1922, and he set up a successor publishing house to the St. Petersburg Society called Yuval. In 1924, he moved to Palestine, where he continued his research, now investigating indigenous tunes from Middle Eastern Jewish populations. He had difficulty adjusting to life there, became ill, and died there in 1927. The second Engel work on the program is called Omrim Yeshna Eretz. They say there is a land, and this is in in Hebrew. The first is in Yiddish, this is in Hebrew. A Hebrew song with a text by Shaul Chernikovsky, a Hebrew language poet from Ukraine who eventually moved to Palestine. It belongs to a genre of ecstatic, early Zionist, idealist poetry, combining a deep longing for the homeland, an affection for ancient rabbinic tradition, and the very modern, secular determination that humans, not God, can determine their own fate. So, we begin with two works of Engel, the Kaddish of Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev and Chernikovsky's Omrim Yeshna Eretz, and it's my pleasure to introduce my collaborator, Raphael Frider.
Bin zu dir gekommen mit dem Teure für dein Volk Israel. Und was hast du zu dein Volk Israel? Und was du sich angesetzt auf dein Volk Israel? Als was nur eine Sache ist, Zaves ben Israel. Was nur a Sach is mein Ibn Israel. Und was mir Bach is Daven Ibn Israel. Taten you kama mois ba'olam Bavlayim, Parsayim, Edomayim. Die Deutschländer, was sagen sie? Unser König ist ein König. Die Engländer, was sagen sie? Unser Malchus ist ein Malchus. Und ich lebe jetzt auf den Sore, mi Berdichev zog, Yiskadal, veYiskadash, Shemei Rabo. Und ich lebe Yitzchak ben Sora, mi Berdichev zog. Ozus min koimi, chtel dich in ordnit rieren, un a Satz soll das sein, un a Net soll das nehmen. Yiskadal, veYiskadash, Shemei
Lazar Saminsky. Altogether unique figure, composer, conductor, musicologist, quote-unquote civic worker, as he is characterized in the title of his biography. He was among the society composers who moved to the US in the 1920s. He was the music director of Temple Emmanuel in New York, the very large synagogue, for around 30 years. He was a co-founder of the League of American Composers, commissioned works by many American composers, wrote 6 symphonies, 2 of which I've recorded, and which you can hear on YouTube, and thoroughly embraced his adopted home. He wrote a book about new American music. He wrote a tone poem in 1936 called Pueblo, a Moon Epic. Lazar Saminsky was born in a small Ukrainian town about 100 miles from Odessa in 1882. His family was comfortably middle class, actively involved with Jewish ritual and tradition, but also eyeing the modern world. As a child, he was recognized as a kind of genius. He spoke French and German. He, by the age of 16, had already translated Descartes' Meditations from Latin into Russian. And as a teenager, he studied not in the religious school, but in a modern lycée, a modern high school for the well-to-do. But in 1900, his family lost all its money, and anti-Semitism made it impossible for him to enroll in advanced academic studies in the centers of Moscow or St. Petersburg. He was eventually able to enroll as a mathematics and philosophy student at Moscow University, but in a short time, he was kicked out for his participation in protest activities. In 1906, he enrolled at the University of St. Petersburg and began composition studies there. Saminsky had significant success as a composer and conductor. He worked with many, many major musicians. His music is not known as much today, but he left a very great body of work. I've chosen 3 works for this end of this set, and these are admittedly relatively slight works relative to his total output, but I think they're appropriate for this program. First, 2 songs from his Opus 12 first Hebrew song cycle. The first is a free transcription of a very touching Yiddish lullaby from a father to his young son that he heard on one of these ethnographic expeditions. In an introductory note, and you'll get the picture with him, in the score he writes, lacking the well-known commonplace elements of Oriental melody, meaning the kind of low melody, the tune belongs to the noblest type of Jewish domestic melody. Note in the text the reference to cheder, or Jewish religious school, and to the Jewish tradition of learning. The second is called Loneliness. It is a Yiddish language lament with words by Ansky, the great writer, who was also on the expedition, as I mentioned. Contrasting the majesty of the heavens, your world is brilliant like the Kaiser's crown, with the painful loneliness of the narrator. And then after these 2 songs, we end this first segment with a kind of novelty. It's a short suite of 6 songs that Saminsky collected and transcribed from many different cultures, not only Jewish culture. The sources include tunes from Georgian, Armenian, Bashkir, Hebrew, and Cossack traditions. Always enterprising and curious and ever on the lookout for examples of music that supported his philosophies, he wrote in the introduction to this piece, the musical world of Europe and America knows very little of the true musical Orient, meaning the eastern regions of the Russian Empire. Owing to various causes, mainly one kind of Oriental melody, the inferior and banal type, born on the streets and bazaars of the East, has thus far found its way into the West. The author of this collection, who had a singularly happy opportunity of long and intimate contact with the loftiest music of Russian Oriental peoples, tries to give in this album several specimens of the true melody of these people, namely the songs born of their mountains and in their villages. We don't know, looking back on it today, what our ethnomusicologists in the modern world would think of Saminsky's work and perhaps appropriation, but it's a very interesting set of songs. So we start with 2 songs from the first Hebrew song cycle, the Lullaby and Loneliness, and then we move to 6 songs of the Russian Orient. Rafi.
starker Gott, kein Welt ist schön wie brillant in Kaiserkrein. Nicht eine Sohn, wie gleich schön, in Orim sich uneilen, Orim uns дорога узка, ах, матка, беда мой, берутся до вораглут. אשר לשלמה ישקרני מנשיקות פיהו כי טובים דודיך מיין לריח שמרנך טובים שמן תורק שמך על כן על אמות אהבוך בושכני אחריך נרוצה הביאני המלך חדריו נגילה ונשמחה מח נזכירה דודך מיין מישרים אהבוך сегодняшний день, день нынешний, не могу я в поле, не за поле доработать, не баранить, да не баранить. со мной, пойдем, милонок, на зеленый садочек, во зеленый сад гулять, во зеленый
We'll take a very brief pause, maybe 5 minutes or so, and we'll come back to Moshe Milner. We'll come back. That was probably a quick 5 minutes, but okay. Moshe, or Moses Milner, was born in 1886 in a small Ukrainian village called Rokitno, near Kiev. His family was poor, religious, and also music-loving. His dad was an amateur violinist. His mother dreamed of her son becoming a famous cantor. He had a very beautiful voice as a child and sang in many synagogue choirs. He was 8 years old when his parents died. Eventually, he enrolled as a piano student at the Kiev Conservatory around 1902, and from 1907 to 1915, he studied in the St. Petersburg Conservatory. Most of his works are fairly small scale, but he also composed an opera in post-revolutionary Russia called The Heavens Burn in 1923. Today we're presenting 4 art songs of Milner, which showcase his engagement with domestic, poetic, and liturgical texts in Yiddish and Hebrew. And we're going to divide them into the first one and then the other 3. So the first work is called In Cheder, or in school, in religious school. He wrote it when he was a teenager, and the text is by Milner himself. Rafi Frider informed me this week that this song, which is really a kind of a scene, a kind of a domestic scene, has long had a kind of iconic status in the cantorial community. In fact, he told me that just a few weeks ago, our former undergraduate voice major, David Childs, performed in Cheder on his recital at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he is studying to become a cantor. This is, as you can see from the text, a song about a young boy who goes to school to learn the first 4 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And despite his obviously very passionate teacher, fails miserably. Milner wrote the following, perhaps reminiscing about his own childhood. He said, "When I was 10 years old, I began to study the Talmud in Cheder. The rabbi made us study very hard, and with great effort, he tried to drum into my head the first 3 chapters of Gittin, where I learned all the most minute details of how to get divorced from your wife." So obviously this is an individual with a kind of affectionate yet also a little bit jaundiced view of that tradition. the teacher keeps yelling at the student, that's it, do it, more, louder, stronger. Torah is the thing. It's a kind of ecstatic recitativo. So I hope you enjoy it. In Cheder by Moshe Milner.
I hope you are good students. Zu mir und du a guck in de kleine Äußerlich Tagere Äußerlich gilderne Äußerlich Gicher komm her Komm her, Jingelene Hänter zu mir und du a guck in de kleine Äußerlich Tagere Äußerlich, gilderne Äußerlich Gicher, komm her Ob kein Mäuren, ich schreck sich nicht Otazoi, setz dich weg und heraus mit Kopf. Setz dich, Otazoi, hör sich zu. Komm jetzt alle vor, komm jetzt Beisbo, komm jetzt Gimmel go. Komm jetzt dalet do Passach alef a Passach beis ba Passach gimel ga Passach dalet da Ot hazoi Otazoi darf man lernen, Jingele, oi beitaiere Jingele. Tu a guck in Sider und ob noch amol. Komm jetzt alle vor, komm jetzt Beizbo, heicher, starker. Oh, oh. Otazoi darf man lernen, Jingele, starker und das Neu darf man lernen, Jingele und das Neu freilicher, lebendiger, genarnig und das Neu, Jingele darf man lernen, teure ist der beste Scheure wusste wenn man dein Jingele jetzt und sei genarnig bist du genarnig Jingele genug schön vermacht dem Sieder, bist frei. Gedenk, mein Kind, a jeder lernen teure, a soll uns der Heiliger Beure. Als man wird dich fragen, was hast du getun in Cheder, hast du sagen, hast gelernt, teure, gedenkt, teure, noch einmal, teure, 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 teure,
The next two works are settings of poetry by Chaim Bialik. If the last name sounds familiar, he was the uncle of the great-great-grandfather of actor and UCLA graduate Mayim Bialik. Bialik was born in the far northwestern region of the Russian Empire in 1873, grew up in a religious household. At age 15, his interest in Enlightenment culture got him kicked out of his Lithuanian yeshiva that he had requested to attend. He later moved to Odessa, where in 1903, the Jewish Historical Commission there asked him to travel to the city of Kishinev, a large city in what is today Moldova, the site of the infamous Easter Day pogrom of earlier that year, state-sponsored massacre in which 49 Jews were killed, nearly 600 injured, Jewish women raped, 1,500 homes damaged. In response, he wrote an epic poem called In the City of Slaughter, which not only described the massacre, but condemned what he characterized as the passivity of the victims. This poem was hugely influential in galvanizing the Jews of Eastern Europe to action, be it joining the ranks of the anti-Tsarists, joining the early Zionist movement, or emigrating to Western Europe and North America. Bialik later moved to Berlin, where he published the first Hebrew-language scientific journal, and finally to Palestine in 1924, where he became a celebrated literary figure. He is regarded as Israel's national poet. He died in 1934. In 1892, the 19-year-old Bialik published his first poem, El Hatzipor, To the Bird. In this poem, the narrator in the small town in Eastern Europe excitedly questions a bird who has returned from its travels to Palestine, a land of wondrous sunshine and warmth, while lamenting his own fate. Sing, tell, dear bird, from the land of wondrous distance, are the troubles and suffering great there, too, in this warm and beautiful land? Do you bear me greetings from my brethren in Zion, from my distant yet close brethren? Oh, happy ones, do they know that I suffer, suffer pain. Milner set another Bialik poem, his Yiddish language poem, called Unter die Grenenke Bäumelech, Beneath the Little Green Trees, in 1914. In this terse and tender vignette, the narrator describes two little religious Jewish boys, impossibly fragile, yet full of intensity and the promise of the future, and oblivious to the suffering that awaits them. Milner's settings of these two Bialik poems are spare, enigmatic, and to me, quite searing. Finally, we conclude this set with Milner's Hebrew language setting of Psalm 13. Ad ana, Adonai, until when, O Lord? Like the Reb Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev in the Kaddish that began this concert, David the psalmist here vociferously questions God, repeating the words, "Until when? Until when, Lord, will you forget me forever? Until when will you hide your face from me? Until when will my enemy be raised up over me?" Milner's music matches the fervency of the text. It's quite remarkable also for what you'll hear as a very advanced chromatic harmonic language. So, El Hatzipur, Unter die Greninka Boimelech, and Ad Ana Adonai.
Shalom Rav Tovech, Tzipora נחמדת, מארצות החמות לחלוני. אל קולך כי ערב מה נפשי ספרי ציפורי היקרה מארץ מרחקים נפלאות הגם שם בארץ החמה תרבה הרעות התלאות התישאי שלום מהחי בציון מהחי הרחוקים הקרובים הידעו ידוע כי יסבול לא יסבול מכאובים הידעו ידוע מרב ופוסות מרבים הורבים לקמים זמרי ציפורי נפלאות מארץ האוויר בינווה עולמי betrachten sich tief und verbuchen sich häufige Tod und neu feigere.
we'll take another few minutes, and we'll come back to something completely different. Before we start part three, just some special thanks, of course, to the Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience, to the School of Music, to the David Victor Foundation, who also supports Yiddish-centered activities. Special thanks to Sophie van Leer, a singer and director of the Jewish Music Project in Amsterdam, who helped me actually to find two movements of the Gnessin that were not in the published score. Miriam Carell, our Yiddish expert here at UCLA, who provided text recordings for the Yiddish texts for the concert. Robbie Good, Morgan Moss, Carlos Duran, who provided transposed versions of some of the scores. Sergei Nesterov, I think, is here. One of our composition graduate students who helped me with the Russian and had some very interesting insights, which I'll tell you about in a moment. And of course, the staff of the Milken Center, Mark Kligman in absentia today, David Brown, Cheryl Holtzman, and all of our production staff. Thank you so much for your help, including Gabby Seipen, our graduate student in piano, who is calling these titles. Mikhail Gnessin was born in the Russian city of Rostov-on-Don. In 1883, he was descended from a long line of Jewish musicians. His father was a rabbi. His mother was an accomplished pianist and singer. He and his 5 sisters were extremely prominent in 20th century Russian musical life. You may have heard, some of you, of the Gnessin Academy in Moscow. It's kind of like the second conservatory in Moscow. This is named for the composer's sisters who founded the conservatory. Gnessin studied with Rimsky-Korsakov at the St. Petersburg Conservatory and became one of Rimsky's most important disciples. In 1908, he co-founded the Society for Jewish Folk Music in St. Petersburg. Those of you who were here for the November concert remember that we featured 2 instrumental chamber works of Gnessin, a piano quintet subtitled Requiem, and a piano trio from 1942 subtitled Dedicated to Our Murdered Children. Today, our soprano, Roksana Zeinapur, and I will perform an approximately 21-minute Russian language song cycle that Gnessin wrote between 1926 and 1929 called Music to the Story of the Red-Haired Motila. Now, on the wall here, you see the title page of the 1925 poem from which the song cycle is taken. The poet was Joseph Achron, then 22 years old and just starting his literary career. Achron's published poem also contains wonderful illustrations, some of which you can see here, and we'll be projecting some of those during the performance, by the celebrated Russian caricaturist Konstantin Orotov. So, who is this red-haired Motila, and what is this piece about? Well, this poem is a tale, and the 9 movements of the cycle are basically vignettes from this much longer poem. The poem is a product of the riotous and wildly creative early communist era of the 1920s. Like other post-World War I tales set to music, For example, Stravinsky's Histoire du Soldat, Prokofiev's Lieutenant Kijé, Kodai's Hari János. It tells the story of a common individual who becomes a kind of anti-hero. When I showed the poem to Sergei, he characterized Mottola, the main character, that's him, as a kind of Forrest Gump figure. And the poem's language and affect as Kafkaesque, very simple language, very direct. So, briefly, Mottola is a Jewish orphan from Kishinev. His father and grandfather were tailors, so as the text says, what he wanted was not given to him, yet he kept his dreams. Although he yearned to study the Torah, he was taught to be a tailor. He also yearned to marry the wealthy rabbi's daughter, but the rabbi, who owed his wealth to his ties with the Tsarist regime, won't hear of his daughter marrying such a poor suitor. I guess suitor, yes. Now comes the revolution, and everything is flipped around. Mottola, the poor tailor, becomes the commissar. The police chief is arrested. The mayor is worried that he'll be next, and the rabbi laments in his synagogue, not for his own people, but that the new order spells bad news for him. This movement in synagogue ends with a long, extended cry from the rabbi, plocha, bad. The movements juxtapose scenes of everyday life, the endless waiting in lines for food, the hustling and bustling at the market, the rabbi and his congregation in the synagogue, a scene of mourning after the rabbi has died. With more philosophical reflections, how time changes and can become so terribly fast under a new regime, and how the old must give way to the new. Sprinkled throughout this text are references to Jewish life. The Torah, the Talmud, Mottola, quote, walking in a procession with the Star of David marching down Main Street like a parade general. In the movement about the death of the rabbi, there is a reference to a rusty Passover tea kettle, chinik, actually, signifying the passing of time. And there's a remarkable reference to a yarmulke at the end of the third song. And the days passed, randomly hung buttons of stars, and the moon like a yarmulke. One more sort of fun thing, this whole cycle begins with a very brief introduction, which is actually a kind of billboard announcing the piece, very meta. And the words to this one-page introduction are the story of the red-haired Mottola, to lyrics by Joseph Achron and music by Mikhail Gnessin. So it's a remarkably rich and very modern collaboration from the 1920s. Please welcome soprano Roksana Zeinapur, and we'll perform the story of the red-haired Mottola.
Pianist, a régiment much